in order for these methods to work, right, we have to get information into a method, and sometimes we'll have to get information out of a method. Right? So if I have a method that computes the average, where do those grades come from? Where does the sum come from? Where does the number of students come from? So I have to have some way of communicating information to a method, and then how do I get the average back? There has to be some mechanism to get information out of the method. The main way that we get information into a method, first of all, they can be present in the private data members. All right. And then the other way we get information into a method is we use variables. Okay. Use parameters. Should have said parameters. And there are two types of parameters. There are value parameters and variable parameters. And these are also known as reference parameters. Right? So, and you know, what we're doing here is, so if the method is operating on the private data members, then it may have all the information it needs to compute whatever quantity, the average or the tax rate or whatever it is. But if we have to provide information from outside the class, so for example, when we assigned a new value to a string object, then we have to pass that in through parameters. And there are two types of parameters, value parameters and variable parameters, and we'll talk more about that. So then how do we get information out of a method? Well, one way is through the return type. And then the other way is by using variable parameters. So variable parameters can be used both for input and for output. And then sometimes, you know, methods will just store information in the private data members. So there may be no return type. So let's look at how we declare methods in the class construct. So you've already seen one example of this for the time class. So when I say, you know, declaring methods in the class construct, and usually what I'm talking about is declaring public methods. And the way we do that, so first of all, a constructor is a little different, a destructor is a little different. So I'm going to use my BNF rules. So the way that we define a constructor is by using the class name and the parentheses, and then we can have a parameter list. And this is how we specify what value parameters, what variable parameters we're going to give, and what information we're going to pass into the constructor. Now the destructor, just for the sake of completeness, takes no argument, so, but I'm still going to give the definition, and it is actually tilde and then the class name. And it takes no argument, so it looks like that. But what's a little bit more interesting are, you know, methods, general methods, methods that are not constructors, but other methods that we might want to write, like one that averages students' grades. And what we see here is we find that we first specify the return type of the method. So that is one way of getting information out of. So a method that computes the average might just return the average in much the same way that the square root function returns the square root of a value. Then we have the method name. So this could be, for example, average. And then we have the parameter list. Just like that. So let's look at the return type. So what can my return type be? Now, one limitation of the return type is you can only return one thing. And when you declare the method, you specify the return type of that value. So first of all, it is possible to declare a method that returns nothing. Now that's different than the class name. Notice that are different than the constructor. Notice that the constructor and destructor do not have any return type. It's not even an option. So if you have a method that returns nothing, you simply use the keyword void. Otherwise, you list one of the basic types. So this could be something like int, bool, character, and double. Right? Or it could be some class that you've gotten from a library that you've defined yourself. So the one that we know about is string. So these are examples of possible return types. And as you start writing your own classes, you can certainly have methods return them. Now let's look at our parameter list. So our parameter list for a method is going to look like the following. So first of all, we can leave it blank. And this is, kind of the empty string, if you recall. So we can leave it blank, and that means it has no parameters, it takes no arguments, or we can use the keyword void. This is I don't see a lot of people using void parameter lists. Usually they just leave it blank. This will be our convention. And then you write some type, which can be, int, bool, character, or some class name. And then an identifier. All right. Now it turns out that the identifier is optional. I tend to include those just so people know exactly what I'm talking about. And then you can have multiple parameter lists. Or I'm sorry, you can declare multiple variables. Let me just rewrite this a little bit. And they're going to have the same form, type, and then another optional identifier. So it could just be a comma-separated list of types. I tend to always include the identifier just so you can, look at the method's definition and have a better understanding. Well, what is this integer? And you get some semantic information from the identifier. And then, of course, you have to have either none, one, or you can have, more than one. All right, and that's how we define our parameter list. If we just use the type and the identifier, then what we're doing is we're declaring a value parameter. And if we want to declare a variable parameter, then we add an ampersand. And so the ampersand actually goes between the type and the identifier. So optionally, we can create and this is for a variable or reference parameter. Reference parameter, okay? So this is no longer variable parameter. But if we add the ampersand, then we're declaring a variable parameter. If we leave off the ampersand, then we're declaring a value parameter. And we'll talk about the differences in those in just a few minutes. So, thinking about these BNF rules, these Backus-Naur form rules, this gives us a lot of possibilities. Think about all the different ways that we could write methods. And I'm not going to associate this with any particular class, and I'm just going to use the word foo as a hypothetical method name. In fact, computer scientists often use foo and bar as hypothetical names of methods or classes or functions or variables and things like that. So foo and bar. So one thing I could do is, I could declare a method called foo, and this would have to appear in some sort of a class. Well, I'll just say the class bar. Right? And I would declare here that foo is a method that takes no parameters and it has no return type. Another thing I could do is write void return type. I have to give it a return type, but I could just leave the parameter list blank, and these are actually equivalent definitions, right? So takes no parameters, has no arguments, and it has no return type. And of course, we can specify a return type. So here is something that takes no parameters or takes no arguments and returns an int. This actually is a very common way of writing get methods or these observer methods. So as an example, for the time class, we had the get hours method. So it looked exactly like this. Now in this case, I'm adding the class and the scoping operator because I'm not declaring this in a class construct, just to let you know that this is a method of the time class. But, whoops, sorry, that should be an integer return type. So, all of our get methods where you're getting or returning an integer quantity are going to look exactly like this. And of course, you're not limited to just an int return type. You can also return a string. And we can also pass information in. Now, this is a declaration of a variable parameter, value parameter, right? And we know that because there is no ampersand. So this actually looks like, and so this takes one argument and it returns nothing, and this actually looks like a set method. So set methods generally have the form void, and then they take a single argument and it corresponds to the property. So if we look at, our time class, we defined set hours, and then we passed in an integer, and we didn't call it I, but we called it new hours. Right? So here we're going to get hours back as a return type. The method is returning information to us. Here we're passing information into the method,